Good evening, one and all. What is going on? Welcome to my YouTube channel. Really appreciate everyone who's tuning in tonight, whether you're watching us live or you're watching the video on demand. It really means a lot to myself and our guest this evening. My good friend Richard from Civil War Seattle is joining us tonight to talk about a little bit of a preview, actually, of some of the upcoming tours that are going to be happening this weekend, Memorial Day weekend in Seattle, in the cemeteries. Those are my favorite places to be. Richard, how are you?
Excellent, excellent. How are you?
I'm well. How'd you like that little video intro?
I was surprised at that. Actually, I'm used to, your other stuff. So I saw that helicopter view of the Space Needle. Like, oh, hey, so they got
Yeah,
a custom intro here. Pretty cool. I
yeah,
was
yeah. I'm trying to up
definitely
my game.
surprised.
I'm trying to up my game here, and just be a little bit different, and not
Yeah,
just have the
yeah,
old
that was pretty
Zoom
neat.
look. uh, so, for anyone who's going to be joining us here shortly, Richard, what, how did the Civil War Seattle brand and project really start? How did it get underway?
Well, it so as a brand, so to speak, I guess it's
Mhm.
kind of a pandemic product. Um, I had been, I'll backtrack here in a second, but I had been interested in Civil War history since I was born, basically, and in recent years had gotten more into the looking into the Seattle specific veterans who were involved, realizing, these were the guys that were at all these different places. I want to learn about that. And the more I got into it, the more I felt this is pretty neat. I want to share this. And I was inspired by so many people on Facebook and on other social medias. I got on to following your channel at that point and several others and thought, I'm just going to throw this out there and see. It's just a fun hobby project. I was reading all this stuff, and it's a neat story. I'll write up a thing and put it on. And then from the very start, there was a tremendous enthusiasm for it, both here locally and from institutions and other historians all over the country, friends and people that I didn't know. So I just kind of went with it. It just had this momentum, and everybody's like, "Wow, we've never heard about this stuff. Tell me more." And that was the consistent thing. So it really grew from there, became across all social media, and then it turned into a history walking tour business that is Civil War history, but it's also other Seattle history. My most popular one, in fact, is true crime and tragedy in Victorian era Seattle. And it's stories that I just come across in my researching with the veterans. I'm like, oh, this is really cool. This is really cool. And I had a whole pile of them and thought, I could build a program around this. And then other pioneer era stuff here in Seattle. So it's branched out now from where it started 3 years ago to being more incorporating other history. But the real origin of it is that my ancestor, who was my third great grandfather, served in the 83rd New York Infantry. He was wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg at the Slaughter Pen Farm as First Corps soldier under Meade and Reynolds. And I found in one of our Seattle cemeteries several veterans of the 97th New York, and the 83rd and the 97th were consolidated in 1864. So my grandfather, even though he was a 97th soldier for about 5 weeks, that's what it says on his gravestone. And I thought, wow, who were these guys? They must have been with him, right? Like this is pretty cool. And I found that one of them was wounded also at Fredericksburg in nearly the same spot that my third great grandfather was wounded.
Wow.
Both in that same brigade, both in the same ditch where they were kind of pinned down by Confederate rifle and artillery fire. And my ancestor, as a result of a mild wound, went on to become a nurse, detailed for the rest of the war at 2nd Division, 2nd Brigade, 1st Corps Hospital, including having spent 4 months at Camp Letterman in Gettysburg. And I thought, wow, he may have even cared for this guy because once he could walk, he was detailed to be a nurse. And this other fellow who was evacuated from the same spot on the same field to the same hospital and everything, I thought, man, this is very intimate all of a sudden. And that's when I was like, I got to know who these guys are because he may have, been cared for or knew my own second great grandfather. And then it was like, wow, these guys walk the same streets. Oh, there's this guy's house. Oh, he worked in this building. And it just blew up from there. It became very personal at that point. So that's the roots of it in the shortest version.
Yeah. Yeah, when we hear things about the Civil War, we tend to just remember the conflict. We don't remember the veterans, the survivors, and the wounds they carried with them internally, you know, in their minds, in their hearts, or the physical wounds. Some of the stories that I'm sure you've uncovered are fascinating with how these men went on with their life when they traveled west. What are some of these guys that really impacted how you see your local area in new ways?
Well, a lot of them. So just for perspective of scale for people that haven't heard this from me before, directly here in Seattle, there's about 3,000 of these veterans that lived in and around the city. So the now modern day suburbs. Statewide, there's about 14,000. So they're big, them and their families. Average household size in 1890 was 4.2 people. And these men had families. And that in some years makes up 8 or higher % of population of this city. That is a massive portion of a population. If they were, I always say, if they spoke a language, if everything else was the same, but they spoke Portuguese, there would be a museum to Portuguese Seattle history. There'd be a parade. There'd be all this stuff. Like they're that big a chunk of the population. So their impact is everywhere, whether they're an architect or a painter or just came here when they were retired, the Grand Army, its influence here. But the really significant part is a lot of them were part of territorial and state leadership, civic leadership. So from Seattle's Civil War veterans, we had 2 governors of Washington State and Territory, multiple mayors of the city. Judicial ranks were filled with judges at federal, state, county, justices of the peace, police chiefs, lawyers, prosecuting attorneys. Every possible city and county office had these guys because they were all in their 40s and 50s when they moved here. So they were experienced like leadership class that came in during Seattle's formative era. Seattle's a young city. It didn't really get going until the late 1880s. And so these guys were here to really stamp their ideals on this city. So you see it everywhere you look in our civic history. And then there's streets named after them. And like I said, I walk by buildings that they lived in and streets. I live here where I live in a suburb is on the homestead property of a 78th Pennsylvania veteran. He was the first one to live on this land that I own today. So I stand on it every day. And so does most of Seattle's population. If you know that side of things, it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Is it a pretty even split between Northerners and Southerners who arrive, or is it
no,
way, or?
It's dramatically different with these 3,000 plus. I estimate more like 3,500 that probably just, you know, they slip through the cracks and they're cremated, so you don't know where their remains are. So that said, I think there's about 3,500 Union and there's just about 150 Confederates. So it's massively skewed. There's a significant population of Southerners a generation later. So there's way more who are sons and daughters of Confederates that the Confederate veterans never wound up here in Seattle, but they came here afterwards. But actual Confederate veterans are few, actually. But they're interesting because they tend to be of a pretty educated class. So you find that percentage-wise among the Confederates, guys that are lawyers and doctors and civil engineers in appointed government positions at a much higher rate than you do from the Union veterans. So the guys that came here, they kind of had something to do in large part. Yeah, there's a big disparity, but the impact for being 1% versus, you know, whatever, it's they carried a lot of influence historically here.
They saw a new opportunity in different ways than others. Some are going for land and some are going for being the only doctor in the area or something to
Yeah,
that effect.
yeah,
Yeah, that
yeah.
makes a lot of sense. That really does make a lot of sense. What about these men when they are having their reunions? You've talked about that before, where
Mhm.
you have the GAR posts and others who are having reunions and these memorializations of their previous service. What was that like in Seattle in the late 19th century?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of enthusiasm for it, both with the veterans themselves, but also with the citizenry here in Seattle. So one thing is the Washington state became a state in 1889. So prior to that, it's territory. Um, and its population doesn't really blossom until after about 1886, 87. But
Mm,
especially after 1889, that's when the Transcontinental Railroad arrives.
mm,
So we don't have a Grand Army of the Republic here in Washington Territory until 1878, one of the last states or territories in the country
mm. Wow.
to have that, because there's so few veterans here at that point. After that, once they do establish it in 78, the first provisional department of Washington Territory, and then we start to see the first post is in Seattle, then they pop up all over the place. Then they hit the ground running. I mean, they're 10 years behind everybody else.
Mm,
But they've
okay.
often lived in other places where they've been part of the Grand Army in Kansas or Iowa or Michigan. Some of the early members here were members of posts in California. They lived here, but that was the closest place you could join.
Wow.
And then Oregon was 1869, I believe, 68 or 69 that they got their Grand Army. So
Mm,
the very early veterans are kind of waiting for their own Grand Army until the late 1870s. We're like, all right, we've got enough for one post now. Let's get started with this. And they have state level encampments every year. Of course, it bounces around the state. But here in Seattle, man, there's not a holiday that the Grand Army isn't doing something, whether it's
mm,
Memorial Day or the 4th of July or Flag Day or any public occasion. If it's the Elks Parade, there's a
mhm.
Grand Army guy with a drum and a flag in front of it. Like there, any chance these guys can get out there and do it.
Right.
And they have their own veterans events too. So the Grand Army does their things, which often mirrors whatever the Grand Army is doing elsewhere. It's a very copycat organization. So if they do it in Michigan and they like it, then the next year they're doing it in Washington and Oregon, the
Mm,
same style of event. But they had here called the King County Veterans Association, which had an event every summer. It was a big reunion event in what's now called the Woodland Park, which hosted some years more than 2,000 veterans, including some Spanish and American War veterans. But only about half of the veterans here were actually Grand Army members. So they had, to be in the Grand Army, it was a dues paying organization. It wasn't just a veteran.
right.
So they did that as well. So just veterans on the whole are organizing these big reunion events and playing horseshoes and listening to 7 hours of speechifying and all the stuff that they love to do. But it's constant, and they're very, very active civically, the Grand Army and
Mm,
all the women's organizations and everything. So if you
mhm.
were alive in Seattle between 1880 and 1930, you absolutely knew about the presence of the Grand Army and the old soldiers and the blue and the gray and all that. They were out there in public
Mhm.
a lot.
Well, we're wanting to plug your Memorial Day weekend cemetery tours, and we have to start off with the question of uh, when did this idea come about for you, and what was the spark that got you into going into the cemeteries to look for these people?
Well, boy, that's a big question. I think that could be another hour answer for that one.
I wanted to
Um,
catch a drink of water, so I was like, I'll answer a question. It's gonna take a while to answer.
yeah, the what got me into the cemeteries was just again was that so we have a Grand Army of the Republic cemetery here in Seattle, and that's where this year's tour will take place. Um, I went to school about 5 blocks from this cemetery. It has 526 Union veterans buried in one little cemetery plot among the thousands that are buried in our area. And I went to I went to college at art school that was a few blocks away, studying historical illustration head to toe. I was going to be a Civil War artist. I was going to be the next Diane Troiani. And I was just in, and I didn't know that cemetery was there because it's very, very hidden and it's not publicly known. And it hasn't been since it was really started. And stumbling upon it one day and looking at the names going, wow, I'm into this stuff and I don't know about this. That's what made me start looking. And then I found the guy from the 97th New York, and it got me kind of on that path. That cemetery has been a focal point for Memorial Day ceremonies during the Grand Army era. So while those guys were here, that was a big focal point for their annual activity. And then it really fell off for a long time. And there's small groups, the Sons of Union Veterans and the Daughters of the American Revolution for years would go out and do a little, wreath laying kind of thing, a dozen people or something like that. Or occasionally do a rededication of the monument, something like that to get some more people out. But by and large, it's kind of an afterthought. People don't go to that cemetery looking for those stories. They'll go, oh, that's kind of neat. And they'll stop in there. Maybe look at the flags that are over the headstones, and that's about it. And I felt obligated to kind of tell the stories of some of the men, but also why is this place here? I mean, that we have those cemeteries with the same idea in mind as why we have Memorial Day. It's that Victorian Civil War generation that created that culture of remembrance, that culture of commemoration. That place is a direct physical product of that, and there's that connection's been lost. I think the why of why we have that place. So that's really what motivates me specifically on Memorial Day to say, like, that's why they put it here. That's why we have this national holiday, is this same thing. And there's a disconnect between those two for sure historically.
You not only talk about Civil War history as far as what units these men were with, you as we've been pointing out, you talk about how they became good citizens or sometimes became bad citizens of the world.
Bad citizens sometimes.
What's one of those colorful stories of the men who got involved maybe in a murder or in some violence or something else? Because the thing is, we tend to make these men to mythological creatures in that they do nothing wrong. They went on the battlefield, they fought gallantly and brilliantly, and they came home and they were just pillars of society when they're men. And we need to make them more human. You do that with these stories because you find them in the archives and in newspapers. What's one of those kinds of stories that you like to highlight to people, showcase these soldiers, former soldiers, as who they are, which is human beings?
Yeah. Well, there's a few. So there's a couple. There's several that got murdered here pretty late in life. Those are sad and interesting stories. But there's a couple that murdered people. Those are probably at the extreme end. And then, of course, several that took their own lives in very dramatic fashions. Those sort of things, but less tragic than that. There's several that like walked away from their families and left their families kind of in the arms of the Grand Army of the Republic or the Women's Relief Corps to support them because they were drinking or substance abuse, that kind of thing. There's a handful of them that were just homeless guys that literally lived in a tent in the bushes, just like you would see in Seattle today, that were just alcoholics. And one of them, he walked away from the soldiers' home and he says, I'm more comfortable living outside. And he went and lived in the bushes next to the train tracks. And then he disappeared. Like, he's somebody, the last thing mentioned of him is he talked about taking his pension check and going to California, and he just falls off the map. And you can find that story by the thousands today in any city, but especially in our West Coast cities like Seattle and LA. And that's part of what I try to do too, is say these are still guys, they're Seattleites, just like you and I were. And we can go and we can stand in the building where they worked, or we can stand in front of the elevator where this guy got flipped out of the elevator and got killed going up and down the elevator shaft. Like, it's not so different. It's only a couple generations away, and in some cases, there's people who were here in Seattle that were here when those guys were still here, and so that's uh, that's a big part of it. And so I talk very little actually about what Bernie's division did at Gettysburg, or who was on what side of what hill at Chickamauga, because that's already been covered. And there's unique accounts here, of course, that I really leverage. Like, man, this guy left a whole diary of stuff, and that's nowhere but here. So I really get into that. But a lot of it is just like the Civil War aspect is more a context than the end of it. So it's like them having done that, and then they're also they lived in that house right across the street from the cemetery. Like that's what he did. And that guy was a Gettysburg veteran. And here's what he wrote about Gettysburg. And I wonder if his house was blue like it is today, or it was a different color. Like you can have that kind of conversation. It's that close. You can go sit on the steps. That's the same house, same guy. That guy ran from Barksdale's brigade at Gettysburg on July 2nd in the afternoon. And he also, his wife is writing about what kind of cactuses she grew in that window right there. Like, so it's, but people tend more towards liking those stories. Like, who were they as people? But most of them are pretty average, pretty upstanding people. But yeah, a couple of them killed people. A couple of them got killed. A couple of them are really weird guys. There's one guy that was this basically transient kind of homeless guy in our historic neighborhood that wore a hat that was a little umbrella. If you've ever seen those kind of, there's a hat with a propeller on the top, but it's like a little umbrella thing. It fits on your head. And he wore that for like 25 years. Wow. Right. And he became a nationally syndicated cartoon based on this guy because he was tweaked after the Civil War. He was a Wisconsin soldier in the war, and he was like, he couldn't live inside. He just lived off of people's handouts, and he was a famous figure in the city. Umbrella Man. He's like one of the most famous characters in our city's history. And the fact that he was kind of that way because of his service in a Wisconsin regiment in the Army of the Potomac in 1864 on the Overland Campaign in Petersburg, like that's kind of why he wore an umbrella on his head for 30 years afterwards. Wow. They're complicated guys for sure.
Right. And I think that's what we lose in some capacity when we just talk about Gettysburg or Chickamauga or Shiloh.
Yeah.
We lose the human aspect because we're so used to hearing about somebody's division, and we can't picture what a division even looks like because we've never seen actual size. Unless you were a reenactor like us in the 90s, we probably saw what a division looked like in size. But we so desensitize ourselves to the person because we're talking about a regiment, or talking about a division or a brigade or even a company. Well, and I love that. I love that fact that you're bringing that out, right? Because that's especially the part about the homeless veterans. I didn't think about that till you just brought that up, and I'm like, yeah, some of these guys just couldn't do it. They couldn't adjust. When they came back, and and then we have the parallels today.
Yeah, one thing, it's interesting you talk about the difference between sort of interpreting on the battlefields and then interpreting an environment so removed, like I do. And I tell people, I use the 9th New York Cavalry at Gettysburg as an example because there's a guy was an officer in the 9th New York, has a tremendous story, left wonderful accounts of his activity at Gettysburg, and his gravestone, he has a pretty big gravestone in the cemetery in Seattle, and it looks remarkably similar to the 9th New York Monument. Like the shape of them, there's a round disc that's on both of them at the same point. I'm like, man. And I said, these are the same things. One of them is a monument to an individual, this grave marker. It's a big thing. It's 6 feet tall, and it's a big thing. It's not just a little veteran's headstone. It's a big family paid for grave marker. It's a monument, really. And then there's the monument on the Gettysburg battlefield. And I say these are both to the same guy, right? So on the field at Gettysburg, of course, the monument is to those who died in the fighting there. But it's also to all of the men that fought there. that didn't die. That's a monument to 326 or however many men of the 9th New York Cavalry rode on the battlefield at Gettysburg on June 30th, and the 1,000 plus that served in that regiment. And they're everywhere. It's not to Gettysburg. It's like, I think we think that it's the monuments on the battlefield at Gettysburg are to the ghosts that linger on the battlefield of those who died. And I make the case, an argument constantly, that monument is just as much to the 6 9th New York Cavalrymen that are in Seattle as it is to the ones that are in the cemetery there. And those things, those monuments are to the people, not to the dirt that it sits on. Right. Little Round Top wouldn't be anything if they didn't do something there. So those monuments are to the people, not to the rocks and the hill and the dirt and Emmitsburg Road and all that stuff. It's to the individuals. And then you put that individual in a house on Boylston Street on Capitol Hill in Seattle, and you go, they're not mutually exclusive. They're the same thing. Right. And so just to your point, that's something I'm constantly trying to say is like everything that we celebrate in Gettysburg and Vicksburg and everywhere, these are the actual men too. And they were here. They're the Seattleites too. So.
Yeah. We read that in when they dedicated the monuments, they're not talking about the ground that they're staying on. They're talking about the guys who were with them and the guys who are no longer with them.
Yes.
And that's absolutely right. Showing that parallel and it's not even a parallel. It's a intersecting line, you know, for the 326 or however many there were. That's an intersection.
Yeah. And everybody likes to, the immediate knee jerker, the Civil War didn't happen here. I'm like, no, during 1861 to 5, it was pretty peripheral. There was stuff. People were, of course, affected by it. It was political. It was personal. But then that history gets all imported here later in those guys' suitcases, in their minds and hearts and their families and their children. And so it's ours too, just as much here, because in that monument though, it's remarkable. I put on a tour, I hold up the 2 pictures and I'm like, both of these are to Seth Clark. They both are. And then they go, oh, I didn't think of it. Like, now, hopefully that now you'll view it that way.
Right. That's why the Pennsylvania Monument at Gettysburg hits so hard with people, because their names are actually there, you know, and it's like everybody's name is there. Sometimes they shouldn't be because they weren't there, but their names are there, and you see them being etched off. But yeah, that's a tremendous thing to think about. Baron 24 is in the comments right now. Baron, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you being here. Were there any resources available for veterans of the Civil War to help them get back to normal life in the Seattle area after the war, or were they just expected to go home and get back to work? It's a great question.
It's a good question. One thing is that there's a big gap in time between the end of the Civil War and when 95% of our veterans arrive here in Washington. Again, most of them arrive after 1886. So they've had 20 years to kind of get back to work and quote, figure it out. And one thing happens is that a lot of them that can't adjust in those early years, they don't make it here. So there's less, the veterans themselves say you'll see less crippled old veterans in whatever in Seattle than you'll see in New York or Pittsburgh or Chicago, because they just don't quite get here. So when they get here, those that are sort of struggling that way are pretty small, relatively speaking, small in number. So the resources required are not going to be the same as Philadelphia or Boston for carrying, or even Kansas for that matter, where a lot of them had sort of quickly moved after the war. But we did have the Grand Army, of course, to help when they could, or at least turn people into a direction to get help. There's numerous cases where they help indigent veterans or the families after a veteran has passed away. Then they've got their family and their kids, and the nearest family is in Michigan because this guy came out here and they're the tip of the spear for their family. So they can't live with a cousin or an uncle. That makes it unique too, that they don't have a community or family support system the way they would where they had been during the war. Right. But we have women's organizations like the Ladies of the GAR and the Women's Relief Corps and others, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They were fairly active in this kind of thing with charity work and stuff in Seattle. And then we had during the Veterans era, we had 2 state-funded soldiers' homes. There's federal soldiers' homes in states like Wisconsin and Michigan, Ohio, even in California. But here in Washington, the veterans that were part of our Constitutional Convention in 1889 wrote that into our state constitution, that we would have homes to provide care for aging and indigent veterans. So they had a place to go that was run and funded and operated by the state of Washington. So hundreds of these guys wind up in these 2 soldiers' homes. And then some of them, like the guy that lived under the bushes by the Grant Street Station, it wasn't enough for him, and he wound up kind of out there. But a lot of them will wind up getting funneled into the homes for care later on.
Yeah, that's a great point too, that a lot of the guys who just weren't mobile as they once were aren't going to make it out there.
Yeah,
they're staying wherever they stay. They're staying in Alabama or they're staying in Michigan because they need their family, if they have any left, to help them out, or their locale to help them out. It's the first form of, like, if you don't have mobility, not only money but in physicality, you're not getting to Seattle.
Yeah. And so the veterans, one of them actually during I don't know if it was Memorial Day itself, but it was a speech in May that he gave when he was referring to that you don't see crippled old veterans in the city of Seattle because they have to be stronger of constitution to have handled the trip west, whether it was once on the train or over stages of migration to Kansas and wherever. But the other thing is that the soldiers that lived here were generally very young. So we have a lot of soldiers that fought in the last year and a half of the war that were in their teens or early 20s. And then when they get here, they're still pretty young guys. And so we have a lot that die later. So that kind of skews just on the health side of things, too, that they were less likely to find trouble in 1880 because either they weren't here yet or there weren't enough of them. But then by 1910, if they are starting to run into trouble, they're still sort of younger-ish on the scale of things. It's easier for them to fall into the assistance that's there, I guess, at that point, because they're old. It's getting a little hard to describe, but the age and health of the veterans was notable. Anyway, that's for sure. I'll just leave it at that.
I love the course you went on, Rich, with all this stuff, because of the fact that you're talking about them as veterans, as we've been saying, and it's a story that's oftentimes just not told. We get into the Reconstruction era of the United States, and suddenly we're just talking about major national politics. We're not talking about the rights of former soldiers, which there is no GI Bill. There's nothing like this going on. These guys are on their own. They're going back home to who knows what. And they're starting to head off for the West Coast to try to have a new beginning. There's something that we wanted to bring up that goes into this national idea of politics, and the politics being local, as they say. All politics is local, and I think this is a crazy thing to think about, but we actually have anarchist movements, and I really want you to talk with us about Civil War veterans and the parallel with anarchist movements.
Yeah, so this has been something that I've been working really hard on for about a year. I think it has legs to become something bigger as far as a writing project, but I still, at this point, like to start to getting the story out there. So in the 19-teens, so Union and Confederate veterans, generally speaking, got along pretty well here together. By 1906, they're formally marching together as participants in Memorial Day parades and funerals or cemetery observations, that sort of. There's blue-gray reunions going back to 1891 in Seattle. So I just say that because we'll come back to that in a second. But one of the things that really binds them together, interestingly, starts in 1912, and it is their mutual hatred and disdain for communists and anarchists. So that is also, there's two Confederate veterans that were both leading figures in the socialist movement and anarchist movement here in Seattle area.
Wow.
Which again, this goes super deep. So watch for the book in a couple of years.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of spokes coming out from this hub. But in 1912, on May Day of 1912, there was a parade / protest / rally that was in downtown Seattle, just the same as happens to this very day. We have every May Day, there's a thing where there's, built windows get smashed in Starbucks and all this stuff. And, both sides come out to wave their respective flags, and the police are, it's still like, it has never ceased in Seattle. So you could put this story in 2023 and it wouldn't be out of place at all. The communist anarchist people are coming down the street and they're marching and they're cheering, and they have people standing on boxes, leading or speeches and stuff. And they're carrying the red communist flag at the head of the procession. And the United States flag is further back in the procession and it's furled. And the Spanish-American War veterans, who are in their 30s at this point, they're not tottering old veterans with white beards and canes. A lot of the Union veterans are still men in their 60s at this point. They have a plan. They hate these people. They think that they're traitors, they're foreigners, they're, speak English or get out. You hear all this kind of rhetoric. It's just like you would hear today. Wow. And as this parade is approaching an intersection, the Spanish-American War veterans rush out and grab the red flag from its post, and they tear it off the flagpole from the person. And they run into a saloon on the corner. And as the person with the flag runs into the saloon, the other veterans stand and close in front and close their ranks and lock arms as the crowd is trying to surge in. The police show up with their pistols, and then fights start breaking out in the street. And there's like this melee that goes on. A Union veteran comes running down from one of the buildings and tears his flag, this old flag. It may have even been a wartime flag. They say it's a very old flag that was wrapped in paper, and he was waving it around, and he's like, this United States flag will be at the head of this procession. And if they have to march over my dead corpse, I will stand here with this flag. And it's getting hot, really hot. Then the communists and the anarchists throw the United States flag on the ground and start stepping on it and spitting on it.
Oh boy.
It gets really out of hand from there. So the city loses its mind, and it's, they're having these big rallies. The veterans are coming together because they're the most vocal ones about the flag and the disrespect to the flag. The city is rallying behind them. It's just like this intense patriotic fervor now, and they're basically trying to run the anarchists out of town, all this different stuff. And interestingly, even though the Confederates and the Union veterans have been getting along pretty well for a while at this point, it's the first evidence that I've found of them publicly saying something aligned with the Union veterans. And they say that we are one nation under one flag. We stand 100% with our Grand Army brethren, so on and so forth. There's a lot of public sentiment both ways. And they basically say, we will fight for the flag alongside our Union brethren. And then there's a different reaction to the city of Seattle when they are participants in that Memorial Day parade that year. They had been participants since 1906 together with the Union veterans. They're all in the same, the Grand Army posts would have their sections. There's 5 posts, and then the Confederate veterans. But in 1912, they were really in lockstep together, and the city of Seattle went ballistic when they saw the Confederate veterans in the parade that year. Parade was usually kind of quiet, some applause, but when the Civil War soldiers came by, they'd often take off their hats and sign. It was more funerary for those guys. But 1912, man, that they talk about the city full-throated cheering for the Confederate and Union veterans together. And from that point on, there's a public perception shift in them together. They start being more together on Memorial Day in the cemeteries and those kind of things. It's an interesting transition that is the thing that made it cemented their relationship between them, but it was already pretty good. But then in the public eye, they became kind of the veterans in blue and gray were together because they vocalized their support as a group, not just individually. Some of them were very, very patriotic, nationalistic, full-throated Stars and Stripes guys, our Confederate veterans, but as a group for them to come and say, you know, we're gonna. And I think that year when they carried the Confederate flag they were driving in a car, a Virginia veteran named Jacob Heater was the one who carried the flag, and he carried the Confederate flag furled in the parade that year, deferential to the United States flag and also his Grand Army friends and comrades. They called each other comrades, a lot of them. So after that point, it's really, that's the thing. And it's way, 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 way more complicated than that. That's the shortest version of it. But it's interesting that's all of a sudden the public looked at them as kind of a unit after that.
Both defending the homeland from what they believed was a foreign invasion, at least with political thought. It was a foreign invasion.
Yeah, and this continues through World War I. That whole era, it's the same kind of rhetoric. It flares up really bad again in 1917. You know, and then the Confederates are saying they're getting very critical of those who don't want to fight in World War I. And there's examples of one guy giving a speech and a flag dedication in 1917, a Confederate veteran, saying that I can't fight anymore, but I'll stand here with a shotgun and shoot any coward who refuses to fight for the United States. And I mean, they're really, really, really strong about it. And they joined forces on against the anarchists. It's cool stuff. It's fascinating history to me. So
I would imagine, and this is probably a bad assumption, but I would imagine that most of these guys who are veterans of the Union Army who have come west are overwhelmingly white. These aren't like Confederate veterans marching lockstep with USCT veterans. These are white veterans, right?
Yeah, there's a very
vets, right, but
there's a very small number of them. They do participate in the Memorial Day parade. Several of them are Grand Army men. So there's pictures, Grand Army post. You see one black soldier, two black soldiers. The race issue with Confederates is an interesting thing for me. It's a touchy one, and I only have certain little bits specifically that I found in research that I can pull from on these things. Some of them were slave owners, some were not. Some of them were extremely anti-slavery, actually. One South Carolinian and one Tennessean who immediately after the war were like, slavery is evil, blah, blah. I mean, they were super vocal about it. So they're very exceptional. As the rule, I think you just got to assume that they are Southerners. They are former Confederates. There's going to be definitely very entrenched ideas. But there's some things that really stick out to me. And there's one case where we had a Confederate monument here in Seattle. It was put up in 1926, taken down in 2021 by vandalism. Basically, the cemetery, it wasn't removed. It was like flipped over in the middle of the night in a private cemetery. It's a whole fiasco. This thing. They were trying to get rid of it, and people just bulldozed it over with. Anyway. But at the dedication to that monument, and it was made with rock from Stone Mountain, Georgia. It was really driven by the daughters, not the Confederate veterans. The daughters were much more vocal about this stuff on Memorial Day or otherwise than the veterans themselves were. But at that monument dedication, they had Union and Confederate veterans on the platform, probably less Union veterans, of course. But the two soldiers, enlisted soldiers that stood in 1926 at the flagpole next to the monument for the flag raising of the dedication were African American.
Wow.
That is a puzzling wrinkle in the whole thing. You know, were they trying to be woke and trying to be politically correct and throw the token black person in there?
Right.
Or was there a different dynamic that we just simply don't understand? And it surprised the heck out of me. And there's a picture. So it says it, but I see the picture. I'm like, that's a black guy next to the flag he's standing between the flagpole and the Confederate monument, with his uniform on and his gun, his rifle at a whatever respect kind of
Mhm.
pose.
Mhm.
So that's a man, that's a tough one. I
Yeah.
haven't waded too much into it yet, but
Yeah.
there's different dynamics socially than you would see elsewhere in the country.
Yeah,
And
because you have to think too that Seattle is outside the boundaries of the hardcore Jim Crow
yeah,
stuff, and so
yeah.
mentalities could be a little bit different
Just
there.
in
But
some instances, maybe slightly different. There's I don't think you can paint them with as broad a brush as
right,
you could if they were in Texas or Mississippi or Alabama. I
right,
think in 1926 here in Seattle, it's still no friendly place for someone
mm,
who's not white by any
mm,
means. If you're Asian or black here, it's still America in 1926. Make no doubt about any of that. But there's wrinkles for sure that with these specific people, these men that had fought in the Civil War over these issues, do surprising things for sure.
mm,
And
mhm.
someday maybe we'll get some thread of a document that explains it a little bit, but otherwise we just got to go, why are there two black soldiers at the flagpole on the Confederate monument dedication? Like, what the hell is that about?
Right.
I don't know that I'll ever answer that question, but that in other things have long made me kind of go, man, Seattle's got a little different stuff around here.
Seattle's a little different. There you go,
Yeah,
ladies and
yeah,
gentlemen.
yeah. We've got
Yeah,
Confederate anarchists,
right.
and he lived in a
Mm,
anarchist commune, and he wrote about free love between the communal. I mean, it's
wow.
talk about unexpected stuff. And
Yeah,
he's a Missouri Confederate that said he was as hardcore Confederate as there ever was until he learned about the Haymarket riots.
right.
And he read about that and said, "That's me. I'm an anarchist now." And he flipped. I
Wow.
mean, it's wild stuff, man.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, political change can happen to anybody,
Yeah.
and dare I say political enlightenment, because whatever it is, you're going to say that on either side of us versus them. But when he
Mhm.
has this epiphany,
Yeah.
it's got to be like this is a natural thing, especially for maybe a veteran who's just tired of what they experience. They think nothing's working,
Yeah.
and they go a
Yeah.
different path. So
Yeah.
maybe
This
that's what
this
happened to
guy,
him.
he was a self-described old mossback Southern Democrat, and he held it
Wow,
well until Haymarket, and he was reading
wow,
the writings by the people involved with that, and he just said, this is me. Like, I found my identity. Like, I'm gonna,
right,
yeah.
right,
And he went
yeah,
all in.
that's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have talked with him,
Yeah. Me too.
because it'd be like, how? You know, how
Yeah.
does this transition happen?
Yeah.
Did you not feel, like you fit in where you came from in the South because maybe you weren't an enslaver, and then you
Yeah.
fought in this war, that turned into, the rich man's war, poor man's fight, like most wars are.
Yeah.
And then you come west and you're like, oh, I finally found my place
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
anarchists. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of like gender dysphoria a little
Mm,
bit, where they're kind
mm,
of like, at some point he had to realize that, like, that's not me. Like, I am
right.
this person, and now I'm comfortable. And then he moved into that community of people with him and thinking like him, and he was a writer for the newspaper and all that stuff. Like, he found his
Right.
identity
Right.
that way.
Right. And maybe he
Good.
felt that way the whole time. He just finally could let it
Yeah.
out and
Yeah.
say,
It's
wow,
again, there's
I can,
you can find the parallels wherever you want to find them with
right.
this stuff.
Right. No, I love that. I love that
Overall.
kind of like story where it makes you scratch your head, because for you and I studying that period for years now, that is an oddball kind of story where it's like,
Yeah.
where did this come from? How did this happen? How did this transpire? But that's what keeps us in
Yeah.
this kind of stuff.
There's another guy, just because I'll say this quickly because you'll be interested. There's the other, so that's the anarchist guy. There's
Mhm.
another guy who is a socialist, and he was very, very anti-slavery from the minute the war ended. He was a dedicated, verbally and in writing. He left a lot of writing behind, this guy.
Mm.
Um, Follower of Nathan Bedford Forrest during the war. He was an artillerist in
Wow.
Forrest Cavalry. The minute
Wow.
the war ended, he got involved in Reconstruction politics in Tennessee, and he lost the race for Tennessee governor by 5,000 votes in the 1880s because he was so persuasive in his belief, even though he completely turned his back on everything the Confederacy was about. But he said, I never apologized. I was a young man, and I went to war with the belief that I was doing the right thing. So I won't say I regret it, but but man, that was the wrong thing, racial equality, so on and so forth. He winds up coming here to Seattle, gets more into socialism, to the point where he's reading a lot of Eastern philosophy, like all the Buddhist and Hindu texts and things.
Wow.
He becomes a vegetarian. And there's a letter that my friend has in a private collection in Tennessee from this guy, where he goes, this is shortly after he arrives in Washington Territory, and he goes out to this cabin with these guys that he knows from the South, that they like, oh, we'll go out, we'll have a dinner, cook out, have you as a guest. He goes out with some friends. They kill like a grouse or partridge or some kind of bird like that. And he writes home to his wife, who hasn't come yet, that he feels like a murderer for having eaten this bird. And he became a vegetarian not long after. And in the letter, he put a feather from the bird, and he pressed a fern leaf that he had picked off of the property. And he writes everything that he's thinking about. So he goes through this whole thing, and he's into the crazy, like Eastern spiritualism kind of movement and stuff. And he was under Nathan Bedford Forrest pulling lanyards at Bryce's Crossroads, right? And he's an outspoken philosopher of Eastern religion and vegetarian socialist here in Seattle.
Wow. That is,
I mean, just the
cycle of
train. It is. Yeah. And my friend who they found, so I found this guy, kind of looked into him, and then I was connected by somebody from a historical society in Tennessee where he had lived. I said, I found this guy. I wonder if you got anything. He goes, oh, let me get you to this guy. So I met this fellow named Chip, who had just bought from an estate sale a massive collection of his letters from his entire life. Wow. And so he's the one that told me about all this stuff. So he has in mind that this biography needs to be written.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do my part to funnel everything from Seattle. He was a state judge here too. So he was making legal decisions, probably with some of his philosophical beliefs behind them too, which are probably interesting to look into.
Oh yeah. I'd want to see the court documents of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's a new thing. Just in the last 2 or 3 months, I connected with him, and we're both fascinated with this dude. So his story will be one for the ages for sure.
Yeah. Another dude I would love to talk to. It's like, when did this transition happen? Like you said, you're pulling lanyards in Bedford Forest artillery units.
Yeah. He's an interesting guy. There's one letter that he wrote from in camp in, I believe, 1864 in northern Alabama, and he's reading Les Miserables in the camp, and he writes home to his family. That's what he's reading.
This guy's a Renaissance man.
Yeah, you've got all the other guys that are just like, playing poker and whatever, and he's reading that kind of stuff, and he's a very, very intellectual guy. So his writings are incredible. He traveled to Europe, and he writes about witnessing the sunset from the top of Mount Vesuvius, and he's one of one from the Civil War. Absolutely.
Dude, back in the 70s, Brando could have played this guy.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, he's for Brando.
Yeah. I wish I could write screenplays, because I've got dozens of guys with stories that are equally compelling. Oh. And because if they come out here, they're a lot of them, they're cut from a slightly different cloth. Some of them, they really are. They really are. The ones that go up to the Yukon chasing gold and stuff, they're different dudes. They're very different guys.
Yeah. And I'm seen as an outsider in my family because I'm leaving the valley that we've been in since the 1700s. They're like, there's that eccentric dreamer doing his thing. These guys were that way. They were like, I'm going west to find a new life. And it's terrible here, or I can't get work, or whatever the case may be, and they leave. But it's probably good he got out of Tennessee, simply because when things went south, no pun intended, with politics, he probably would have been, he would have had a violent end.
After he lost that gubernatorial race in 1886, from what Chip was saying from the letters that he wrote, he basically I don't belong here anymore. I need to, and he went to Chicago first, and then there was a transcontinental railroad connection. So he's like, well, I'm just going to go there. And that's kind of why he wound up in Washington. He was seeking something different. Absolutely.
Right.
He wasn't looking for a job or whatever. He needed to find somewhere that was going to suit him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And vegetarian socialist, I mean, Seattle's the spot.
I guess so. I mean, what the heck?
This is where you want to go for that. So he was well ahead of his time in that regard.
Or an anarchist. I mean,
go
to Seattle,
Yeah.
So
it is an anarchist jurisdiction, according to Trump, so why not?
That's where it all goes down. These tours coming up this weekend.
Yeah.
Tell me about the tours themselves, and tell my viewers about the tours themselves, what they can experience if they're in the area, and kind of how the day progresses.
Yeah. So what I've done is scheduled them. In previous years, I've just done them on Memorial Day. And then a lot of people would say, I got plans, I can't come. So this year I decided we'll do them all weekend, 12 o'clock at the Grand Army of the Republic Cemetery here in Seattle, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. I'll be there. If it's one person or 50 people, doesn't matter. We're going to be there. We're going to do the right thing for the soldiers, for their legacy, for anybody that shows up. What to expect is going to be a little bit of what we talked about. We get into these personal human interest stories with a lot of these guys, and that's really what the heart of my tours are about. But the Memorial Day tour will actually walk through the history of the cemetery itself, which is unique and fascinating. It began in 1896, and its whole kind of bumpy and turbulent history, the fact that it's still even there, is kind of a miracle. And then the history of what was Memorial Day in Seattle. Starting in 1879 with the first one, what was that like? Where did that happen? What was going on? Until the 1890s, when parts of it began to occur directly there in the cemetery. So with the background of the history of Memorial Day in Seattle, and then what happened here in this park on this ground. So many of the men who were the chaplains and the speakers and the sergeant of the guard and the flag bearer and those kind of things on those Memorial Day observations in that cemetery are now buried there. So we'll stand next to Frederick Hurd's gravesite or Addison Hasty's gravesite and say, this is what he said. Sorry, I'm getting all worked up here. This is what he said on Memorial Day. He stood right here and he said this. He read this poem about his fellow comrade who passed away 2 years before, that he personally wrote because he missed his friend and his comrade. And this is what he said here, and kind of recreate it a little bit that way. And we'll read the Grand Army of the Republic part of their service, their Memorial Day services. There was a lot of prayer, so I'm not going to go through all of that, but I'll read the dedication portion of it on the ground where they did it. And then if we have time, we can, of course, get into some of the individual stories. But the individual stories will be more about these were the veterans in the cemetery on Memorial Day. What did they do? Here's their pictures in the Memorial Day parade. Here's their pictures otherwise. Here's a picture of the parade in Seattle in 1912 or 1888 or 1940. And then and here's the guy in the picture. Let's talk about him. There's years where Buffalo Bill Cody was with the veterans marching in the Memorial Day parade. Some of them knew him personally. We'll talk about those stories, but it'll be very Memorial Day centric and very history of the cemetery centric and less people centric, I think. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. And it's on CivilWarSeattle.com under tours, I believe.
Yeah, under tours or Seattle History Tours. That's a different name that gets you to the same website. At 12 o'clock. I love it if people make a reservation so then we know who's coming. But I just want anybody if you're walking by, somebody's walking by in the street with their dog and they want to stop in and listen for half an hour. I'm for all of it. And this will be the first year that the cemetery will have flags in a couple years. So it'll be fully decked out. It hasn't been for the last couple of years with COVID. So it stops people when they go by. It's an awe-inspiring sight. And if I can help explain what it is, why those flags are there today, and why you have the day off work, then I'll feel like I've done my part for those guys. And because they wanted, that's what they wanted. That's why they left it there.
Right.
So
right. in addition, we're not only talking about your tours this weekend. What other styles of tours do you give, Rich, to the general public so they know for the future?
Yeah, so I do them in a variety of the cemeteries around the city, because every historic cemetery here has dozens and dozens and dozens of old Civil War soldiers. It's not just this Grand Army Cemetery, it's every cemetery. So there's kind of a rotating schedule with some of those. Coming in July, I'm going to do Seattle at Gettysburg. That's my favorite one on July 1st and 2nd. That's telling the story of Gettysburg through the stories of these individual men. Where were they on the battlefield? What was the first day's fighting? Here's 150th Pennsylvania. Here's 6th Wisconsin. Here's 7th Wisconsin. Here's the 9th Cavalry. These guys were there. What did they do? Learn about Gettysburg through individual stories. And my most popular one by far is True Crime in Victorian Seattle. So that's started with relations to the Civil War stuff, guys that got murdered or guys that were a coroner and had to investigate these cases, into just the craziness of like getting killed in Victorian Seattle. And I do that one every Sunday, and that's by far the most popular one. And it's fun. It gets me out of the Civil War tunnel a little bit, so I can do some other history as well. And ultimately, I hope to have more pioneer era history, and then maybe bring in other historians that have tours programs that I think meet what I would do myself, and people can book out for topics that I don't have the authority to talk on, but other people do. So I'd like this to expand into a Seattle history tours to be, maybe a World War I expert, or maybe a guy Native American history tour, or African American history, or Asian American history, whatever. I'd like to see it grow into its own bigger project down the line. I think you can appreciate, diversifying the history too. So that's a goal.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, we're going to get everyone over to CivilWarSeattle.com. Check out the tour section. Get ready for Memorial Day weekend.
Yep.
We know a lot of you have the entire weekend off. And
an hour.
Take an hour or two out of your weekend and go see Rich, because you're going to hear some great stories like the ones we've talked about tonight. But you're going to be able to see where these people are buried, or take another tour at a different time and see the locations where these people may have lived or worked, and enjoy yourself with that. So, Rich, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this.
Thank you.
I hope you have a great time this weekend. I hope the weather holds out for you.
Me too. I think it's going to be good. 60 and 65 and sunny is what it's looking like. So, I mean, you can't beat that.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect stuff.
All right, John. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in and commenting, and for those of you who watch this later, thanks to you too.
Yes, thank you everybody. I hope you have a great evening. Take care of yourselves. Keep reading. Stay out of trouble, and I'll see you on the next one.